from Michel Foucault. Kapitel 5. Right of death and power over life. For a long time, one of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power was the right to decide life and death. In a formal sense, it derived no doubt from the ancient patria potestas that granted the father of the Roman family the right to dispose of the life of his children and his slaves. Just as he had given them life, so he could take it away. By the time the right of life and death was framed by the classical theoreticians, it was in a considerably diminished form. It was no longer considered that this power of the sovereign over his subjects could be exercised in an absolute and unconditional way, but only in cases where the sovereign's very existence was in jeopardy, a sort of right of rejoinder. If he were threatened by external enemies who sought to overthrow him or contest his rights, he could then legitimately wage war and require his subjects to take part in the defense of the state, without directly proposing their death. He was empowered to expose their life. In this sense, he wielded an indirect power over them of life and death.
Etter det på sin Petty Kulturropen. Oké. Wat? Ja. Zo?
Ja.
Cool.
Ik ben live.
Wat?
Het is een livestream.
Cool.
Dicht. In this sense, he wielded an indirect power over them of life and death. But if someone dared to rise up against him and transgress his laws, then he could exercise a direct power over the offender's life. As punishment, the latter would be put to death. Viewed in this way, the power of life and death was not an absolute privilege. It was conditioned by the defense of the sovereign and his own survival. Must we follow Hobbes in seeing it as the transfer to the prince of the natural right possessed by every individual to defend his life, even if this meant the death of others? Or should it be regarded as a specific right that was manifested with the formation of that new juridical being, the sovereign? In any case, in its modern form, relative and limited, as in its ancient and absolute form, the right of life and death is a dissymmetrical one. The sovereign exercised his right of life only by exercising his right to kill, or by refraining from killing. He evidenced his power over life only through the death he was capable of requiring. The right, which was formulated as the power of life and death, was in reality the right to take life, or to let live. Its symbol, after all, was the sword. Perhaps this juridical form must be referred to a historical type of society, in which power was exercised mainly as a means of deduction, prélèvement, a subtraction mechanism, a right to appropriate a portion of the wealth, a tax of products, goods and services, labor and blood, levied on the subjects. Power in this instance was essentially a right of seizure, of things, time, bodies, and ultimately life itself. It culminated in the privilege to seize hold of life in order to suppress it. Since the classical age, the West has undergone a very profound transformation of these mechanisms of power. Deduction has tended to be no longer the major form of power, but merely one element among others, working to incite, reinforce, control, monitor, optimize, and organize the forces under it. A power bent on generating forces, making them grow and ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit, or destroying them. There has been a parallel shift in the right of death, or at least a tendency to align itself with the exigencies of a life administrating power to define itself accordingly. This death, that was based on the right of the sovereign, is now manifested as simply the reverse of the right of the social body to ensure, maintain, or develop its life. Yet wars were never as bloody as they have been since the 19th century, and all things being equal, never before did regimes visit such holocausts on their own populations. But this formidable power of death, and this is perhaps what accounts for part of its force and the cynicism with which it has so greatly expanded its limits, now presents itself as the counterpart of a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. Wars are no longer waged in the name of a sovereign who must be defended. They are waged on behalf of the existence of everyone. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. Massacres have become vital. It is as managers of life and survival, of bodies and the race, that so many regimes have been able to wage so many wars, causing so many men to be killed. And through a turn that closes the circle, as the technology of wars has caused them to tend increasingly toward all-out destruction, the decision that initiates them and the one that terminates them are in fact increasingly informed by the naked question of survival. The atomic situation is now at the end point of this process. The power to expose the whole population to death is the underside of the power to guarantee an individual's continued existence. The principle underlying the tactics of battle, that one has to be capable of killing in order to go on living, has become the principle that defines the strategy of states. But the existence in question is no longer the juridical existence of sovereignty. At stake is the biological existence of a population. If genocide is indeed the dream of modern powers, this is not because of a recent return of the ancient right to kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of population. On another level, I might have taken up the example of the death penalty. Together with war, it was for a long time the other form of the right of the sword. It constituted the reply of the sovereign to those who attacked his will, his law, or his person. Those who died on the scaffold became fewer and fewer, in contrast to those who died in wars. But it was for the same reasons that the latter became more numerous and the former more and more rare. As soon as power gave itself the function of administering life, its reason for being, and then logic of its exercise, and not the awakening of humanitarian feelings, made it more and more difficult to apply the death penalty. How could power exercise its highest prerogatives by putting people to death, when its main role was to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, to put this life in order? For such a power, execution was at the same time a limit, a scandal, and a contradiction. Hence capital punishment could not be maintained except by invoking less the enormity of the crime itself than the monstrosity of the criminal, his incorrigibility, and the safeguard of society. One had the right to kill those who represented a kind of biological danger to others. One might say that the ancient right to take life or let live was replaced by power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. This is perhaps what explains that disqualification of death, which marks the recent wane of the rituals that accompanied it. The death is so carefully evaded is linked less to a new anxiety which makes death unbearable for our societies than to the fact that the procedures of power have not ceased to turn away from death. In the passage from this world to the other, death was the manner in which a terrestrial sovereignty was relieved by another, singularly more powerful sovereignty. The pageantry that surrounded it was in the category of political ceremony. Now it is over life, throughout its unfolding, that power establishes its dominion. Death is power's limit. The moment that escapes it, death becomes the most secret aspect of existence, the most private. It is not surprising that suicide, once a crime, since it was a way to usurp the power of death, which the sovereign alone, whether the one here below or the Lord above, had the right to exercise, became in the course of the 19th century one of the first conducts to enter into the sphere of sociological analysis. It testified to the individual and private right to die, at the borders and in the interstices of power that was exercised over life. This determination to die, strange and yet so persistent and consistent in its manifestations, and consequently so difficult to explain as being due to particular circumstances or individual accidents, was one of the first astonishments of a society in which political power had assigned itself the task of administering life. Ja, ich mach Pause.